I'm the city's utility director, so I oversee the water, wastewater departments as well as electric department. Tonight's meeting obviously is about the urban water management plan, but just want to go over some logistics first. And so this is an open Zoom meeting. So you have the ability to unmute yourself. And so like to remind people to please keep their mics muted unless they're speaking. If you'd like to ask questions, please put those in the chat feature. And then also we will take brief pauses between each section tonight to answer 3 or 4 questions before we move on to the next section. We do want to move through each of the sections, but we thought that it would be pretty relevant for people to ask those questions as those sections are presented. But we will do more question and answer at the end. And if you do think of other questions over the next couple of days, please email them to the group and we'll try and get you answers for that. One of the other things about having an open Zoom meeting is that if the comments in the chat section get inappropriate or people don't manage their mics appropriately, we will end this meeting and we'll just reschedule it for another time. Don't anticipate that happening, but just so everybody knows what would happen if that did occur. So could we move to the next slide, please? So just going over the agenda for tonight, there's some key points that we wanted to talk about. So generally the purpose of the Urban Water Management Plan, overall general purpose is to really look at the city's water supply and the city's water demands and see if those two things match up over a long period of time. There's certain criteria that we look at, and this is provided to the city based on a guideline that's presented by the Department of Water Resources. And that supply and demand ratio is looked at under different scenarios. So we look under a normal year, a year that has something close to average rainfall. But we also, more importantly, look at what happens in drought years, what happens when the city loses its water supply and the demand doesn't change, or what is the needed reduction in demand. And those are probably the more important parts of this urban water management plan, and certainly what we are experiencing this year. We'll talk about what our 20% by 2020 results were from the previous efforts in water conservation. We'll talk about climate change and how that is affecting our water supply and what we think that we need to do maybe over the next couple decades to adjust for that. We'll also go into detailed numbers regarding what the city's water supply is and what the city's demand analysis is. We forecast what that demand looks like over the next couple decades. Then finally, we talk about demand management. How do we increase conservation? How do we use water more efficiently over the next couple decades, such that our water supply.
Someone's not muted, and I'm getting mixed audio.
So again, this is an open meeting, so please continue to keep your mics muted if you're not speaking. And so with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Felicia, and she'll walk through the first section and hand it off to a couple other staff members that I have here, Patrick Foos and Rob Skates, as we go through the presentation. So thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. Griselda, if you can go to the next slide. The next one after that. And the next one after that. Thank you, perfect. So one of the components of the Urban Water Management Plan, before we start looking forward, we want to look back. In 2009, California passed the Water Conservation Act of 2009, called the SBX 7-7, which is an absolute mouthful. It was really branded as the 20% by 2020. And so starting in 2010, the city of Healdsburg used a predetermined methodology of how are we going to quantify this. And essentially we looked at 10 years worth of water usage data from 1995 to 2004 and quantified how much we used on average between those 10 years and what's a 20% reduction of that. And so what that means is when we looked at 1995 to 2004, that 10-year baseline, we were using about 203 gallons per capita daily. And what that means is per person per day. And so we had established two targets. There was an interim target in 2015, and then the final target of 2020, which was that 20% reduction. And so in 2010, our interim target for 2015 was 182 gallons per person per day. And the actual result was 177 gallons per person per day. And so in this year's urban water management plan, we're quantifying, did we achieve 20% by 2020? And the answer is yes, we did. The target was 162 and the actual was 160. So we actually even came in below our target. And so we can kind of pat ourselves on the back and then talk about like, how do we do even better as we move forward? So I will pause there if we have any questions about the 20 by 22 SBX 7-7 results. And a reminder, you're welcome to drop any comments in the chat all along the way. And if I don't see anyone's hand up, we can move to the next section. And I don't. So with that, I'd like to, oh, yep, Linda, go ahead. You're more than welcome to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was trying to chat, but I chat too slow. So I was wondering what the first two slides were.
Oh, the first two slides were just the run through of what the urban water management plan is, which Terry kind of reviewed, less the bullet points.
Oh, because I couldn't really hear him. All right, will that be in the, will this PowerPoint be available?
The PowerPoint will be available and this meeting is being recorded, so it'll be posted on the city website and social media channels for review.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Brigitte, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So just to be clear, the urban water management plan is actually a requirement. It's a public policy requirement from the California legislature. So we have to do this to protect and evaluate and prioritize and mandate a plan for our basic needs. So this is something we have to fulfill. And our deadline is what this year? June 1st or July 1st?
July 1st.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And then I am getting a question in the chat of how do you calculate gallons per capita daily? We essentially take our total water usage and divide it by our current annual population. And so it does entail total city water usage. From there, we can do what's called a residential gallon per capita daily. And we basically break out how much are residents using versus businesses. And the rule of thumb is about 70% of all of our water in Healdsburg goes to residential use. And so if you take your gallons per capita daily and divide it by 70%, you'll get that residential usage. But gallons per capita daily represents total citywide usage, schools, facilities, businesses, and residents.
If I could just make a comment that it would be really helpful to break out residents and commercial, because you know what it takes to get those two entities to conserve is a little different. And you know, we've got some new developments coming in that are planning lawns and things like that. And so it'd be helpful to know what those two components are. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I think for the purposes of drought communication, that is extremely important. For the purposes of this SBX 7-7, this is the metric that they're looking for, but I do appreciate that.
Felicia, is there any way we can see each other, or is that not going to be happening this way? Only when the person talks, right?
So as a participant, you should be able to see everyone. You just have to change the
Okay, sorry to bother you. Okay, I'll figure it
problem.
out. Sorry, thanks.
problem. Okay, so I think we'll move on. I'd like to introduce Rob Skates, who is our superintendent for water production and wastewater treatment, who will take on the next component about climate change analysis.
Okay, thank you, Felicia. Good evening. So yeah, just a little overview of what we'll be looking at climate change wise. Basically, chapter 3 in the plan is going to detail the city's water system, service area, boundaries, population, demographics, land use, but also climate. So the plan through water code legislation permits various levels of management planning while accounting for climate change. So obviously Healdsburg recognizes climate change, effects on weather patterns and water supply, and of course, the importance of accounting for these changes when analyzing our future water security. In this plan, whenever possible, historical data will be updated to ensure forecasts are based on recent conditions showing the impact of climate change. Next slide, please. So we're continuing to basically focus on reducing greenhouse gases, working with some of these organizations here, particularly RCPA. Data from the irrigation information system was gathered for the next couple of slides. So we have some resources to look at the past. We have kind of some historical views going back about 100 years. And then also we've collected recent data within the past decade as a kind of a comparison. Some of the included information that we're looking at is some reference evapotranspiration rates, which is kind of, it's basically a, I guess you could call we call it ETO for short, kind of the amount of precipitation for turf to grow from either rain or irrigation. We also look at average rainfall over the periods of time, and that's in inches as well, and average temperature. Let's see, so we've got, I guess we can go to the next slide and we'll take a look at slide number 3. So this is a pretty basic slide here. We're looking back to about 1931 on some of this data as far as the historic ETO goes, and the temperature as well. Obviously, we can see, I don't know if you guys can see the screen very well. We can see a little drop in the temperature as well as the ETO in the recent decade compared to the past 100 years. We're kind of investigated that. It looks like it's could be attributed to a result of increased inland temperatures and more frequent arrival of foggier and cooler climates in our area. If we look at the next slide, please, we can clearly see how rainfall, which we're all concerned about the rain these days, shows a dramatic difference. The historical showed a much better recovery in the winter times for our reservoirs. Over the past 10 years, we didn't see the good recovery. And obviously for this particular area, we get most of our rain, just about all of our rain, in the winter months. So we definitely don't expect to see anything in those middle 5 months. You can see that the numbers aren't on there, but what we had kind of for rainfall was a drop from 41 inches average rainfall per year to about 25.9 in the recent decades. So pretty considerable. Let's see, we've got, I think let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the California Department of Water Resources gives us guidance to basically how to deal with the difficult approaches to considering climate change in our service area, as well as the potential impacts on supplies and use. So we do have water supply diversion sensitivity, which we're going to go into in the plan. One critical element of that would be the curtailments. We have seen curtailments over water rights over the past 8 years. We're expecting to see that again this year, and obviously part of this plan, we're planning for future curtailments of our waters. Water source demand sensitivity, like I said earlier, kind of the previous slide, we do have droughts expected to become more frequent, more severe, and so basically the reservoirs never recover, and we're definitely seeing that again this year. So not a lot we can do about the reservoirs, but how we can prepare for kind of that water source demand upstream and all around us will also be in the plan. Water source quality sensitivity. This will be a very educational year as we are in another year of drought. And we're seeing historically low levels in the reservoirs. Even the operators of the reservoirs aren't sure what's going to happen later on this year as the levels drop historically low, and as far as how the quality is going to be affected. So it'll be interesting to see that. We will plan, obviously update the plan according to what we see this year. And next slide, please. And so, yeah, the kind of a bleak expectation of the future here. We do have basically kind of an assessment here, which, like I said, more frequent, more severe droughts, but also on the other end, kind of the rainstorms. 2 years ago, we were underwater here. Now we're dealing with 2 years of pretty excessive drought. So one thing we're going to look at, in the plan is how we're going to deal with these different climate extremes, which were coming up. Included here, I've got obviously, we're going to have to be dealing with agriculture and the droughts and recharge of reservoirs. Also, wildfires as a result of these temperature extremes. But so this was just a little overview of what we will be analyzing in this section of the Urban Water Management Plan. Next slide, or any questions, I guess.
Yeah, Rob, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Bridget Mansell.
Hi.
Hey, I really appreciate your work. I just want to start with that because you've been there a long time. A long time. You've been doing a lot of good work. And I don't mean to say this in any way other than total sincerity. I appreciate what you've been witnessing. And I know it's hard because with everything going on, you guys are being asked to do a lot, but we're citizens, we're here. And I totally just want you to feel that because honestly, this is not easy work for what you're doing. And I just want to thank you for that. So I just had to say that to start out because I know it's bleak in terms of our prospects for getting a big solution quick. Thank you, Rob.
I sure appreciate that. Thank you. Anything else? Okay. Thank you, everybody.
So up next, we'll have Patrick Foose, our utility engineering manager, kind of do the deep dive into water supply and water demand analysis.
I made the rookie mistake of not unmuting myself. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out and joining us in this Zoom meeting. So the first step in looking at our demand projections is to look at population changes. The previous urban water management plan and the first step for our version of the urban water management plan was to look at the outside edges of the puzzle, which would entail 3% growth over the first 10 years and 1% growth after. So the 3% is residential. All of the other water use sectors would grow by 1%, at least that's our assumption. And that represents the outside edge of the puzzle for us. So our current population is hovering just over 11,500 people. And our current water demands, at least for 2020, was 664 million gallons. And if we escalate that out to 2045, a 25-year period, population would increase up to 18,000 people, just over 18,000 people, and projections would be around 962 million gallons. The next slide, please. To contrast those outside edge of the puzzle look, it really serves us well to take a look at what our historical norm has been as far as growth. So we looked also at 1% in residential as well as 1% in all the other growth sectors. So again, we have the same starting point at 2020, but looking out at 2045, instead of just over 18,000, we're just under 15,000. And instead of 960 million gallons, we're at 746. So this represents our range that we were looking at as far as population growth. But what does that mean in terms of drinking water expansions? And I was thinking about how to best convey this, and engineer, let's use a graph. So next slide, please. So these are a graph of our historical population. That's the blue line, and historical water use up to 2020 over the past 10 years. And you can see that there was a profound dip around 2015, and that was the teeth of the last drought period. And we're finding ourselves very near that now. The reddish line, that is the 1% growth water use, and the blue line is the 3% residential growth water use. So there's a bit of a departure on those that you don't see as markedly on the population, but the numbers are bigger. Next slide, please. So under ordinary years, ordinary rainfall amounts, we would be able to use our full complement of water rights. We have 4 of our own water rights. They're at Gauntlet, Fitch, Dry Creek, and Diggers Bend. We also have a purchase water right from Sonoma County Water Agency, currently Sonoma Water. The total water right that's available to us is 2,119 million gallons. We can't use all of that right now. There's a portion of the year that we can't use the Fitch water right because of turbidity, and that limits the water right that's available to us to 1,826. We do have on the horizon potentially a filtration project that could enhance that particular water right, either at Fitch or maybe at Dry Creek, and that could enhance our total water portfolio to 2,119 million gallons. We're anticipating that would be sometime after 2035. So for the purposes of demonstration, I've added that water volume available after 2040. Next slide, please. So as you can see in this graph, under ordinary conditions, we have an ample water supply for our current conditions as well as projected growth. And you might have noticed the conditions have been anything but normal. So let's look at some drier periods. So the first, next slide, please. The first look was at a dry period, and the initial look was, well, what's the worst that it's been lately? How bad can it be? So we looked at the curtailment from 2014, and we lost complete use of our Gauntlet water right and 25% of the purchase water from Sonoma County Water Agency. It encountered a 54% reduction overall. So we went from 1,826 million gallons available to 849. And if you move to the next slide, please. And you can see that this doesn't paint as rosy a picture given the growth.
Can you explain why the Gauntlet disappears to zero?
In the previous drought period, there were water right curtailments that came from the state of California and who monitor the water rights. So that was a directive from the state. Okay, thank you very much. In the near term, it looks like we've got enough water to cover that particular reduction in supply. As time progresses out, things become a little less clear that we'll be able to continue our present water usage and experience the growth that we're anticipating and still have an adequate supply of water. Matt O'Connor, I see your hand.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Just following up on that Gauntlet question. I understand it's from a curtailment from the state. Why was it all applied to just that one site?
We have a more senior water right at Fitch, and Dry Creek's on a different water source. It's on fed from Lake Sonoma rather than from Lake Mendocino. Okay. So I think it's because it was a more junior water right. That's why that one was curtailed.
Okay, and since I have you and I've already interrupted you, let me do one more follow-up question. I was looking at the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. online, and I read that there's a pending water right for Dry Creek, and is that included in your, that doesn't seem to be included in any of your scenarios so far, and what's the status of that?
It is not. That has been being chewed on by the folks at the state for decades. So I don't know when that will shake free. And in the interest of just being realistic with the numbers that are being presented and the scenarios that are being presented, I'm not presenting that as a water right that we would enjoy.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the questions. Okay, so long story short on this one, 54% rejection, just like we had before. For the near term, probably okay. As time progresses, things get a bit more dire. Next slide, please. One of the things that Felicia had touched upon and we experienced before in the previous drought was the city of Healdsburg was able to reduce its water consumption through some conservation measures. And I have seen quite a few of them in the chat zoom by. And a 20% reduction in demand could be realistic. So next slide, please. So a 20% reduction in demand. This is across all use sectors, reduces the water use such that when we have that 54% reduction in supply, we're still able to provide water throughout the planning horizon of the urban water management plan. So at this point, we haven't stressed things out enough. I think that we are on the cusp of unprecedented times. The drought that we're experiencing now is a bit more severe than the drought that we were experiencing from 2013 to 2018. So the outside edge of that bubble, let's say if there was a reduction in water supply by 70%. How that would come down from the state, I'm not entirely sure, but 70% seems like it could come down that way. Next slide, please. So the brown line that's hovering just above 500 million gallons, that's the 70% reduction. We just barely eked over that during the 2015 drought. And you can see that at current uses and at forecasted uses into the future, that water supply is insufficient. So there would need to be some reductions. In toying around with these numbers, getting the demand lines to fall under the water supply line was something of a challenge. So the approach that I took, and if you can get the next slide, please, was to indicate what level of reduction as time progresses would be required to meet that 70% reduction in water supply. So the top numbers, those represent the 3% growth in the residential sector and 1% growth for all of the other sectors and for the first 10 years, and then 1% growth for everyone throughout. And you can see that those numbers are, there's some pretty significant reduction measures that would be required. But that 3% growth, that's not our historic norm. Our historical norm is more or less 1%, and that's reflected by these bottom numbers. And you can see that even those would require a significant reduction in water use throughout the population of Healdsburg. Next slide, please. The Urban Water Management Plan guide document requires us to look at multiple dry years. The single dry year being the outlier, how dry can it possibly get? So we explored that. The multiple dry years was the historic 5 driest years in the record. The ones that I found were 2011 to 2016. And the water that's available was about a 25% reduction in the available water supply. Next slide, please. And what that reflects, with that 25% reduction in the water supplies, that with our ordinary uses and anticipated growth scenarios, 3% and 1% in that residential, first 10 years of residential, we're able to make our water deliveries under that scenario. So that didn't seem as big of a concern. But as Rob Skates said in his presentation, we're probably going to spend a bit more time in this scenario and between this scenario and that most dire scenario as time progresses. Next slide, please. Time for a brief Q&A. Mr. McInhill.
Thank you, Patrick, and both Felicia and Rob. Those were great presentations, very helpful. Just a comment that, and one of the reasons I'm interested in seeing the numbers broken out for residential is just for comparison's sake. When I look at the trend from 2014 to 2020 and the numbers you report to the state for residential use, Healdsburg's at 125 gallons per day. And if that is in the ballpark, I look at, say, Roner Park and Santa Rosa at 80. So just a comment, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for conservation in the residential sector. And I just applaud the people who are doing what they're doing in the chat. So, but I just really an observation. And I think too, you might get to it later when you get to reliability, but certainly with climate, certainly the Potter Valley project is an open question and certainly such a big part of the water balance in Lake Mendocino. So thanks again for the presentation.
Sure. In commentary for breaking out the water use by sectors, we do have line items for residential, industrial, commercial, institutional as separate entities, all the way down to water losses. So those are in the report. Those are broken out. For the presentation, I thought that would be perhaps death by tables for me as a presenter. Ms. Benoit.
Yes, thank you. And this question, I'm a newcomer to Healdsburg. I've only been here about 3.5 years, and I do want to say thank you to all of you for making this an open Zoom meeting and allowing these kinds of questions. But as a newcomer, I could only go back and read the 2015, and I don't know whether any of you were employed by the city at that time. I'm guessing that you were. How did we get that one so wrong? In the sense that, and I quote, the water supply prospects, quote, are very good. We should have a true sense of security. That's another quote. Projections were made 20 years into the future, and city officials were told that by the year 2035, the city's water supply was expected to be, quote, 4821 acre feet, but demand will be much less, only 2857 acre feet. The city's water supply was supposed to be more than adequate for its projected population growth. And I'm just trying to figure out, when those projections were made, and that was coming at the end of a drought or in the midst of a drought, how could those projections, how do they fit into what you're doing? Don't you have to draw on those projections from what you did in 2015-16 and bring those into this report, or is this just a brand new report?
Well, certainly. And can we back up a few slides? I did look at the level of reductions that we had in 2014. Please up more. More. Okay, more up. Okay, so this is our normal year. This reflects when we do have adequate rainfall and adequate supplies in the reservoirs. This reflects a big more water than is available than we have demand. Next slide down, please. One more. There we go. So this Up one. There we go. So this one reflects the 54% reduction, which they might not have had dialed in at that time. So this was one that I don't know why it was missed, but I am experience being what it is. We now know that this was the level of reduction that happened. And one of the things that they didn't do and didn't have privy to was that extreme case of 70% reductions, which I think is again, the edge of the puzzle. And I don't think that they were hitting that edge quite as hard.
Okay, well, just a bit of a follow-up question then. In terms of calculating this GPCD, I'm still a little bit confused about how that's done as well. As, yeah, I know that you say 70% of that is residential. But for instance, how does a hotel factor into that? So some of these folks in the chat are posting these great ideas about water conservation. But if someone's taking their bath water out and watering their plants, and someone else in a hotel is not really taking seriously the drought that we're facing, that can really balance that in terms of averages. So how are those things calculated? I mean, are there some that are, you know, using a very large amount of water and others that are using very limited amounts? How does that get monitored? How does it get evaluated? And when I look at the time period in which I've lived in Healdsburg, just 3 years, when I came, there were 387 hotel rooms, and now there's 678 with another 175 on the way. How does that growth get factored in to these urban water plans? I understand residential growth and building new homes, but I don't understand that other piece of it. So if you could, or anyone could comment on that, I'd really appreciate it. And again, thank you very much. I appreciate you doing this.
That may be a topic of one of the future or subsequent slides in the presentation. So I'm not going to take the deep dive on that. And if it doesn't hit that point, let's have a discussion about that at the end of the presentation. Ms. Mansell?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all your work, Patrick. I know that you've been very innovative, and Terry has too, to try to look at different solutions about water. And I just want to mention, since Tyra brought it up, that I was on the dais in 2015 listening to the Urban Water Management Plan. And if you want to listen to it, we didn't have a video then. I feel like I'm responsible for that because I listened to the consultant, and I understand what you're saying, Patrick. But my question, I guess, is, how can we inform our city council better so that they don't do what I did, which is trusted a report that really doesn't reflect reality now, because normal isn't normal. And after COVID, I'm ready for anything. So, I mean, it's all so distorted about what we can depend on and what we know and looking at those numbers. So my question is, how are we going to use, and maybe this is too rhetorical, but how are we going to use this opportunity tonight to actually help our city council make policy decisions that will serve the future of sustainable Healdsburg? Because this has been here before, and I have to bring it up because I have guilt about being on that dais and saying, oh, it's all great, and everyone thought I was being sarcastic, but I listened to the consultant that we paid a lot of money to, GHD, who was, I think, in earnest, like you said, Patrick, no ill will, but now we're working in a different way, and we're asking residents to sacrifice because it's all about the residents. But then we know hotel rooms are growing, and it's all perception anyway, right? Like if you think other people are getting something and you're not. So I guess it's kind of creepy to say, but you know, you can't ask residents to do something that we're not asking everybody to do. So I just hope that the question is, how can we get the city council to behave in a way that will be more effective than I behaved in 2015 when I went along with the program? Thanks.
That is a topic I'm certain of a subsequent slide. So rather than step on somebody else's thunder, I'm going to let, when Felicia hits upon that topic, let her have it. Do we have time for one more? I see Mr. Unger's hand up.
We do have a few more minutes, yes.
Yeah, Patrick, I'll actually wait until I see the rest of the slides, given that you've provided a bit of a preview of what's going to be coming.
Great. Thank you. I don't see any more hands up. So
Just one more question in the chat that I think that we could address here, which is what is the % of population increase that's forecasted based on the housing project? So basically what they're asking is, did we include Montage, the Mill District, the North Area Entry? Was that included in our population growth? And does that fall into the 1% or 3% category?
well, if everything were to become occupied all of a sudden, it would fall in the 3% category. But as development kind of pokes on, as the historical norm, it would fall more under the 1%. So unfortunately, that's not a smooth answer.
Okay, there is also a question about toilet flushing, but I think I'll wait until my section coming up. So with that, I think we will move on to demand management. So if Griselda, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so within the urban water management plan, there are 3 topics around demand management. So I'm going to talk to them in generalities, and then we can probably hash out some of these really specific questions. The first is we are required to have a wastewater prevention ordinance. So currently we have our what we call our water shortage emergency plan in our Healdsburg municipal code. I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar. We are in our stage 2 of that emergency plan, which starts to restrict certain water wasting activities like hosing down hardscapes. The second component is, it might seem really simple, it's metering, but you can't track what you don't measure. And so the city does have 4,500 water meters. And within that, kind of the future goal is to be able to provide customers with a user interface to have a better sense of how much water are we using in our households and in our businesses. This information is available on your utility bill, but it's a little archaic. And so the goal with this metering is, how do we get that information to the people so you can make more informed decisions about where your water is going and potentially being wasted. The third component is conservation pricing. And so right now our water bills, the water component of your utility bills has 2 components. The first is a flat rate, and the second is a per unit rate. And so in theory, while the per unit rate is fairly inexpensive, there is a financial incentive to use less. And we all know that the less water you use, that informs your seasonal sewer average and can reduce your sewage costs. So there is some conservation built into our water bills and pricing structure. The fourth, I think, is the biggest ticket and something that's certainly top of mind for me, which is public education and outreach. And this happens in multiple ways, be it utility bills, social media posts. We do have what I would describe as like passive rebates, trying to remind people that if you swap out your toilets, there's an incentive for that. Our most popular program has been our lawn conversion. I did a quick look back at since the middle of 2015, while we were still in a drought, we have been able to capture about 6,500,000 gallons per year of water savings as a result of all of our rebate programs. And we've converted about 310,000 square feet of lawn. So certainly the lawn conversion and toilet replacements being some of our most popular programs, and building in conservation on a day-to-day basis and reaping those rewards year over year. Certainly more work to be done on that front. Another component of demand management is looking internally at our own system and our system losses. And so when we produce water and we deliver it, what is the delta between that? And oftentimes that's resulting in system loss. And so we're really trying to actively manage and, more importantly, repair any leaks that are in our system. In 2020, we completed, actually Patrick Foos completed a large tank replacement that did result in a reduction of water loss. So this is certainly a logical place to start in making sure that we don't waste water. And then the last component is a conservation program coordination and staffing. So the city of Healdsburg has a utility conservation analyst, that's split between our electric utility and our water utility. So certainly many of these items are my responsibility. In addition to that, we are part of the Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership. We joined that last year, and there's a couple of cool programs I just wanted to take a moment to highlight that maybe would have been a hard lift for a small city, so it's beneficial that we're part of this bigger entity. One is a water saving plant label. When you go to Prickett's, through the partnership, they've identified drought tolerant plants, so you can make a more informed decision. The other program that Healdsburg does a really good job of taking advantage of is the Sonoma County Master Gardeners Program. It is volunteer master gardeners that will come out either virtually or in person outdoors and do assessments of your landscaping and give some suggestions on how you can reduce water waste. It's basically just geeking out over gardens, but totally free. And so my bigger point is through that partnership, we're able to offer a variety of programs that would otherwise be a little challenging for a small city to offer. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to point out kind of 3 other things that might be happening, some of which might be below the radar. The first is building efficiency standards. And so when we think about new development, it's important to keep in mind that these buildings are far more efficient, both on an energy side and water conservation. So there are requirements around the flow rates of toilets, urinals, faucets, and recirculation pumps in residential homes are now required. And so an example of that is like in a lot of our homes, our faucets are flowing about 1.5 gallons per minute. In a new building, it's 0.8. And so really building in conservation for new construction. Another thing that's in progress, and I know that we'll get better at, is we have 2 combined pieces of legislation that is the state essentially telling us we need to improve conservation in all jurisdictions system-wide. And what this looks like is starting in 2022, every jurisdiction will have to average out for indoor residential use 55 gallons per person per day. In addition to that, the Department of Water Resources is assigning, they're really doing a deep dive parcel by parcel to assign each jurisdiction with a landscaping allotment. And so starting in 2022, we will have really specific guardrails around what our usage can be. And so it's kind of building in that demand management for the years to come. And then the last one, because I have gotten this question understandably a lot this spring around like, what are we doing with landscaping? So we do have what's called a water efficiency landscape ordinance that applies standards for irrigation system efficiencies and encourages climate appropriate planting. Currently, this applies to all new construction, major retrofit projects that are contractor installed that are 2,500 square feet or more. And then for an individual that might be doing their own landscaping project, the water efficiency landscape ordinance is for 5,000 square feet or more. This ordinance does allow for lawns. I'm just gonna say that I'm just gonna own that. It is something that we should probably consider in the future is like, is that a good use of our water? But there are some checks in place around landscaping, not to say that those can't be improved. Okay, I think I'm going to pause there before we move into our water shortage contingency plan. These things are somewhat related, but I'm going to quickly review the chat while people raise their hands and ask questions about demand management. And we can circle back to the question around residents and businesses if we're ready for that. Does anyone, let's start with live questions. Okay. Tim, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Felicia. First off, I wanted to say thanks to Tyra Benoit for raising the points about the 2015 study, which candidly, in hindsight, was about as far off the mark as you could possibly be. The cheerleading that went on in terms of some of the quotes that were mentioned, I just don't understand. Believing that low flush toilets and restricted flow controlled shower heads and smaller clothes washers are the panacea, personally, I think is unrealistic. I'd like to see how they project in terms of savings from a data point of view. I think they're a great action to take, but it strikes me like it would only serve to offer the tip of the iceberg as an analogy in terms of impact. We are way behind our recycled water initiative. Also, at the time of the 2015 consultant study, our population was 11,680 and projected to be 14,000 by 2035. Our population is now roughly 12,100. And Patrick, I was wondering, in your projections with those nice graphs that you did you fold in the new RENA affordable housing numbers, which are frankly quite sizable and approaching 400 in terms of total homes being added for the affordable community? With another couple thousand residents coming from Montage, Mill District, and Comstock, that takes us to a population of 14,000 by 2025, or a decade sooner than the 2015 report projected. And it doesn't take into account the 350 additional hotel rooms from those projects, their water usage, or the 350 employees necessary to run those developments. I'm curious, can we work with those three mega developments and ask them to modify their behavior in terms of not installing lawns and things that will significantly contribute to the conservation model? Comstock is just starting to scrape dirt. Montage is very far along, and Mill District is also in the initial stage of construction. I'm not aware of any elements of agreement within the development agreement that lets them behave differently than with their water usage than anyone else. But I'd be curious, Felicia or Terry, if you know that to be true, or am I off on that point? And lastly, the city appears to be approving swimming pools still. And that's a head scratcher. And I'm also seeing a quite sizable number of new lawns being installed. And I don't know if we can encourage those folks to, to make different decisions or not, but it's certainly not going to help the problem. Thanks, Felicia.
Felicia, do you want me to try and chime in on the development?
Sure, please.
Maybe the potential tools that the council has available and the community could consider. So certainly here, new development, there's the baseline codes that the state of California pushed forward. In every code cycle, they improve the efficiency for energy as well as water. And any new building permit would be required to meet those Title 24 requirements, those efficiency standards. Now, the council and the community have the ability to consider additional measures that may be cost effective. And, an example of that would be the REACH code that the city pushed forward last fall with the help of Felicia. But you can also look at, landscaping, water efficiency in those, what they were termed as green building codes. And so that may be a method to look at some of the newer development and say, hey, how do we behave better? And I think it might be a good question for development to look at how do they continue to operate their business if droughts, times of needed conservation are going to become more frequent, right? Nobody wants to go to a resort that has dying landscaping. So how do they build landscaping that's drought resilient? So that seems like that would be a potential option for the community and council to consider as far as new development.
Terry, chiming in with that, Patrick referenced earlier in his presentation that development's kind of poking along in Healdsburg. there's an initiative to do a clawback of about 170 allocations in the GMO. And if that passes, most of those are going to go to these big developments. And then poking along will no longer be the accelerated path in which growth happens. The council might want to reconsider how it's going to approach that. And lastly, the county is looking to approve 46,000 acres for pot cultivation. Pot uses 3 times the amount of water that grapes do. And I'm wondering if our influential council members, and we certainly have 5 of them, could contribute favorably to helping that decision not be so aggressive.
Yeah, there is a council member on this call, and so I'm sure he's hearing, those concerns with the growth of marijuana and that water usage. And I do believe that the county's planning commission does look at, is there an available water source for those land uses before they permit it, especially with the marijuana farms. So that's an issue there. But yeah, those are things to look at. And then as far as growth, certainly the 2 management strategies that the city has is the urban growth boundary, right? The city is locked into a shape, and it's not going to extend beyond that without some significant changes from the community. And then there's also the growth management ordinance that you mentioned, that there's a potential to claw back potentially some unused allocations that if timeliness in business and building would have happened, they probably would have been already built. But there may be some stair stepping, and that's really the intent. When we looked at the growth, is that if we did have rapid growth, something that's 3 times what the historical trend is, if we had 3% growth for the next decade, what would that do to the water supply? And that's really the reason of trying to look at that, is if growth did accelerate, what would happen to our water supply? And under normal years, which when is a normal year? That's a good question. But under normal years, we have the water supply. Under drought years, we certainly have a need for conservation. And we really have a need over the next decade to build conservation into our daily lives, such that we don't have to do such deep dives of conservation when we do experience these droughts.
Yeah, I think that, stair stepping the GMO clawback, I think could be a good idea. Clearly, I don't think we want to have the front end of town torn up for 12 years because Mill District doesn't have enough allocations, but maybe there's a way to tier it or phase it in terms of the way that clawback would be put into effect, and then only used in the large developments and not for market rate homes. Using them also for 160 AMI, missing middle homes. Ozzy might be able to add some light to that. I see his hand raised up as well. Thanks again, everybody.
And so there are some comments in the chat that I'd like to kind of read off for Felicia. So
Terry, can I comment
Yeah.
on the cannabis issue that Tim brought up?
Absolutely.
So first, I'm just so happy to be here. I've been a little bit quiet just because I'm here to kind of observe and better understand your questions and your concerns as it relates to this water emergency that's happening. Specifically as it relates to cannabis, that item is coming before council sometime before the end of this year. And so I think it's important that we consider water usage as it relates to cultivation. I know initially on council, there was an effort by a council member to parse out a segment from the overall conversation around cannabis. And I know the consensus on council was to have a full holistic discussion. And I think many of the points being made here today in terms of our water emergency will likely be raised when we have that more holistic conversation, just because there's a retail component, a manufacturing component, and then also a cultivation component. So very excited to be hearing all of your questions and concerns, but did want to comment and give a little bit of context on that.
Thank you, Ozzy. So there is another question here from Ozzy in the chat. So the question is if there is a hotel that has been longer in the city, how are they able to abide by updating efficiency standards? So Felicia, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the conservation programs that we have available to all businesses and residentials.
Yeah, so at this point, an older building is eligible for any of our rebates, be it the toilets, gray water system, lawn conversion. If an older hotel or building does a major remodel or renovation, it will trigger the building code, at which point they will have to update. And so it just depends on the age of the building, any retrofits or remodels that they're doing, or just any initiatives that they take where they want to update their fixtures.
I guess my question was more around if there's an older hotel and they're not adjusting their toilets, they're not adjusting their faucets or their shower heads. How does the city know, right? And because it's the city needs to address it if there is a hotelier out there that is just using water recklessly. And so what is, like, how do you define whether a hotelier is recklessly using water, or and then how do you tell if a hotelier is actually conserving water? How do you make that distinction?
So I don't, at this time, I feel like everyone is looking for very specific data around hotels. Really what we have it broken out into is like commercial customers versus residential. I know that's not what people want to hear at this moment, but I don't have like a play-by-play for each hotel in Healdsburg in terms of like, who are the water savers and who are the water wasters. That's not to say that's something that we will be looking into as we get into this drought, who are the largest users, and starting to target those. And I imagine that certain buildings will rank a little bit higher on those high water use lists.
I guess just my final comment is just like, I think, ongoing, I think it would be important to have it segment by segment in industry. So instead of just commercial, can we define it as, by specific industry? For example, here someone raised, a hotel resort versus a motel, not getting super succinct and calling out a hotel per se, but just understanding, what just the different components of who's using the most water, because then we can kind of address, conservation, we can target conservation efforts better. So that's just my only comment. And thank you. Great presentation, you guys. So appreciative of your work. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So another question that's in the chat is from Don McInhill. Can we ban new lawns at new development? So that's Felicia.
Yes, sure. It is a council policy decision. It's something that we could certainly bring forward. And I think that there is an appetite for trying to restrict things that are inadvertently wasting water and a little excessive.
Yeah, and it's certainly in a drought where there's restrictive outdoor irrigation, installing new lawns is just not a good decision. Not financially a good decision, not a good decision for the water supply that we have. Another question is, are there any resources available regarding residential rain, water capture, and storage for landscaping purposes? Felicia?
So we have a rebate for gray water systems. We don't necessarily have an incentive for rainwater capture, but it's certainly been on my mind starting last fall. And so that you could see that come up as a council decision to enhance the suite of rebates that we have and add some new ones. And I think rainwater capture and improved gray water system rebates definitely make the list. Do we want, Matt O'Connor has had his hand raised for a while. Do we want to let him ask his question live?
Yes.
Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up a couple of things I've heard. Recycled water is available. I'm not sure what the status of the purple pipe getting close to the city is like. I just would like to know what the status of making that more accessible or usable to offset irrigation demand, maybe in the residential section and other sections. I know there is some work to do a citywide thing on big lawns and like the schools and stuff like that. And also, separate question is pricing policy, conservation pricing was mentioned as one of the current demand management tools. And I'm just wondering, is that as efficient as it could be? Is there a possibility of rearranging that schedule and possibly realizing additional reductions in demand in that way? Thank you.
So taking the question about conservation pricing, tiered pricing in water has been a tool that's been used for many years, but recently cities have been sued over using tiered pricing for conservation. And because of Prop 218 requirements, basically you have to only recover the cost to provide the service. You can't provide a penalty structure, or you can't provide a reason to recover excess charges as an incentive or a penalty to high users. Cities have been sued in those rate structures and had to find ways to return that money back to the customers and the consumers. So a lot of cities have tried to shy away from conservation. One tool that people have used as they've looked at in drought scenarios and times of short supply, the need to continue to recover rates such that you can maintain the operations of the water system. What's surprising is the water operation system is largely fixed cost. The variable cost to provide the water, produce the water, move it around is really the smaller portion of the ongoing costs. It's really those fixed capital costs, fixed maintenance costs that really drive the rates. And so under severe conservation, such as 20, 30, or 40%, those revenues drop significantly, and a lot of entities are not able to cover the rates. And so during drought seasons, they tend to kick in those tiers, and those seem to be defensible. And the city is looking at establishing that type of rate structure, but nothing's been put in front of the council or been approved by the council at this point for those.
Thank you. Is there any answer about the purple pipe water, recycled water availability for the city or people in the city?
So we are working on the recycled water project. We did go to council in 2018 and looked at the options to meet our discharge compliance with the regional board. And one of the things we're always concerned about is the affordability of our utility rates. And so we looked at structures that in typical years would allow us to meet that discharge requirement, but also try and keep the lowest possible rate for the customers. Affordability in utilities is pretty important, especially when you're looking at water supply and wastewater. Those are base needs that everybody needs to be able to afford. So we looked at agriculture irrigation, seemed to be the lowest cost, and we pursued the lowest cost option first. The section option that we're looking at in more of a long-term range is trying to bring recycled water into town such that the park system, the school district, the cemetery, as well as the golf course could use that recycled water to offset their potable water use for irrigation. Now that project is estimated to be somewhere around $10 million. The city doesn't have $10 million to fund that project. We are right now trying to work with the state government as well as the federal government to receive grant funding for that project and see if we can accelerate that because we do see that as an advantage to our water supply situation, certainly in drought years. But it's just a matter of trying to find those funds to make that project happen.
And are there any other, I've read about that in the 2015 plan. That sounds like a great way to use some of that water. Are there other considerations of smaller scale distribution of that kind of water that could significantly offset some of the urban demand for out landscaping water?
Yeah, we currently have we have 3 programs in place. One is obviously our agricultural pipeline. The second is a self-serve kiosk that we're seeing all of our local construction companies are currently using for construction and dust control. Landscapers are also using the self-serve kiosk. And we are in the process of developing a residential and business recycled water, very temporary program to kind of get us through this summer and fall. Information is kind of forthcoming. We're still building it out and trying to figure out how to manage the costs associated with that. And so we will try and best communicate that through city channels as we have something more substantial to offer to residents in the form of a delivery program.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep. Bridget, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think Steve had his hand up too. I didn't want to take, Steve, did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the recycled water. I've asked around to a lot of people that I know, and they'd all be very interested in using recycled water instead of potable water for their irrigation. But that would require, I mean, I don't have a truck and I don't have a big tank. I'd be willing to buy a tank if I could get water. Is that something you might consider doing? Is that in your plan?
That's the plan that we're looking at right now. And I'm actually going to link that with Marilyn Joyce's question in the chat, which is the city considering providing free recycled water holding tanks and deliver that water? And right now, what we're looking at is the resident is responsible for getting their own reservoir. The city will deliver the water at a subsidized delivery fee. We're looking in and around $30 to $40. The truth is our water fund cannot afford to wholeheartedly subsidize this program. And so residents will be responsible for the upfront cost, essentially $1 per gallon for storage. So if you get a 200-gallon tank, you're spending about $200. And the other thing you'll be responsible for is a small pump to be able to apply that water through a hose. A fairly reasonable startup cost to be able to irrigate your property through the summer, keeping in mind there will be delivery fees. And it's just simply a function of the full cost of the program is more than we can absorb.
I think a lot of people would be interested in such a thing.
Yeah, and to just dovetail on that, since I was going to ask a question, that's what I'm asking. And I know you already know my question, Felicia, and I know that Director Crowley's heard it. And I know that I've talked to Rob Skates, and everybody knows Bridget wants to get a tank for her house. I want to do it and spend $1,400. But my question, and that wasn't sarcastic, I'll do it. My question is, can we put recycled water pipe above the ground? Would that make it less expensive? Because I understand we didn't put purple pipe on Healdsburg Avenue, which is where I thought we could, but we didn't because we didn't decide on that. That's awesome. But can we put it above ground? Engineer question. You don't have to answer right away, but I want that in your mind because I've seen pictures of other places where they actually have the water, recycled water with clear pipes so that people can see it rolling by, which would be very interesting, I think. But anyway, design wise, it might be cool through the Mill District. But my question, I guess, is just where are we going with recycled? Because I think it's really like the most pressing issue for this summer is how do we get that? So I'm glad Steve asked that question, Mr. Kotler. Thank you. And I really want to work on that. Thanks.
Let me just follow it up with one question, just because I don't know the answer to this at all. Do we use all the recycled water that comes out of our treatment plant, or does some of it just get thrown into the river?
Patrick, do you want to take these two questions, the above ground pipe as well as the what we use on a seasonal and annual basis?
Certainly. The above ground pipe, apparently it's in place someplace. I'd be interested to know where. One of the primary issues that I would want to unravel on that is, bumping into it with a car or whatever. So if there's an avenue to get there, there's definitely a possibility. I would have to look into those details. Usually the pipes are buried for protection. So moving on to the recycled water usage. Last year we used pretty much all of the wastewater that was sent to us, with the exception of about 2 million gallons. So we distributed I believe the number is 47 million gallons, and we stored another 40 million gallons here. The influent flow was down a bit because of COVID, and the influent flow is going to be down a bit this year, I think, because there's a drought. That said, I do not believe that any will be discharged to the river this year during our discharge prohibition period. Does that answer your question?
It almost does.
All right.
I guess what I'm really asking here is, do we have excess recycled water to give to residents?
Oh, certainly. We anticipate that there's going to be approximately 40 million gallons stored on site here at the wastewater plant. And that's available through the kiosks, most certainly. And as a delivery project gets developed, or at least goes from concept to some level of maturity, maybe a pilot program, we can get that distributed to the citizens.
We have two more questions about recycled water, and then we are going to move on to our water shortage contingency plan and a little bit of a wrap up, because I think we're getting some really good feedback. But Patrick, just really quickly, Windsor charges agricultural users for recycled water. Does Healdsburg also charge ag users?
At this time, we do not. We, in exchange for passage through some of the vineyard, getting rights of way through to develop our pipeline projects, the water is provided to the vineyards at no cost, and is provided to the construction users at no cost. Is provided to the landscapers at no cost.
And so I think that sort of answers the second question that we're getting, and then we are going to move off of this. Who was the recycled water delivered to last year? Can you give the high level?
For the most part, it was delivered for vineyard irrigation, agricultural uses, and a smaller portion for construction and landscaping purposes.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for all of those questions. I think one of my big takeaways is I need to get better data around hotel water usage. And I know we've heard a lot about lawns and pools, which I think is actually a good segue into the water shortage contingency plan, which is a component of the urban water management plan. And so I'm going to have Terry tackle the next two slides and talk about that. Griselda, if you can go to the next, there we go. You're muted.
Rookie mistake, sorry about that. Apologize. You'd think after a year that we would all know how to mute and unmute, but I still get used to talking normal. Can't wait till we can do this in a normal group setting. So as is, you know, during a drought year, we have a need to curtail or save water, reduce our demand usage, change how we think about water. Hopefully some of those thoughts and changes are long-term, and we can build some drought resiliency, but we do seem to get into these times of short supply and need to have some metrics, some measures that we can use to really reduce the water demands during the summer. And so the city right now has a 3-stage plan referred to as this water shortage emergency plan. It really intended to, under emergency situations where our water supply is short, is to reduce that demand. The current urban water management plan has 6 stages, and this is what the Department of Water Resource is recommending, is that all entities move toward the 6-stage plan. And the benefit of the 6-stage plan is it's more consistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So when Healdsburg's at stage 2, it means the same thing as when Santa Rosa's at stage 2. And so we're looking to move towards that. And those 6 stages are progressive in their need for conservation. Next slide, please. So here's the 6 stages. And so they simply walk through conservation. So they go from a 10% to a 20% to a 30%, 40%, and so on, up until 60% reduction. The first stage is voluntary. There's no enforcement. We're really just asking people to be conscious with how they use the water and conserve where they can. And typically a 10% reduction in usage is not hard to achieve. When you start to get to a 20% reduction, that is hard. We do enforce that with a mandatory obligation. And so one of the things, the biggest things that we start looking at for these 20% reductions is irrigation. So outdoor irrigation, really look at limiting that to 3 times per week, not every other day, not every day, but 3 times per week to really get people to reduce the amount of outdoor irrigation. There's certainly other steps. Certainly commercial customers, hotels need to also conserve that 20% and meet that number. We certainly look at the development community and say that no more potable water for construction purposes. They need to switch over to recycled water, which means that they have to haul that water from our kiosks. And so that's an increased cost to them and a burden, but it's an obligation under these situations. And then as we roll through these, we continue to look at outdoor irrigation and reducing it. So 2 times a week and additional measures, commercial customers, again, they would have to go from a 20% to a 30% reduction in water usage and really be smart about how they're using it and so on. You get to 40%, there's still 1 day per week of outdoor irrigation. That's pretty severe, but a 40% reduction is a significant loss of your water supply. And then at 50%, no outdoor irrigation. And then we start to institute, because it's hard to continue to add new measures, we really start to institute water budgets for customers and really try and get them to look at only using 50 gallons per person per day. So really looking at their indoor water usage as well as eliminating all their outdoor water usage. And so this may be that you take shorter showers. This may be that you shower every other day. This may be other measures. That there was a lot of really good ideas listed in the chat early on in this meeting. All of those would be things that we would be asking people to do in these 40 to 50% mandatory conservation levels. And then again, 60% mandatory, we go further into this, no outdoor irrigation, but then also looking at 40 gallons per person per day and really looking at how people use that water indoors and how can they use that water multiple times to affect some pretty significant conservation. And so these are the tools that we have under this water supply shortage. As Rob mentioned, droughts are likely going to become more frequent as the years go on. And so we will likely see more of these mandatory stages being initiated under these losses of water supply. And so these tools will continue to be flexed as needed in the summertime and the falls. And then we'll also, in the normal years, we still need to work towards conservation and really looking at how we drought and harden the system. Next slide, please. And so if there's questions about demand management or the water shortage contingency plans, this is a time we can ask a few or answer a few of those questions.
Steve, do you want to unmute and go ahead?
What teeth do we have to enforce these draconian, if we get there? I mean, can we begin fining people and putting them in stocks in the middle of the plaza?
Well, we can't put them in stocks. You can't put them in the stocks in the middle of the plaza, but we can fine them $1,000 a day. And we can potentially remove their water service or restrict their water service. So restrict the flow of water into their service or completely disconnect it for that water waste.
And that does not conflict with what you said about being sued for predatory pricing, quote unquote?
So when you violate the city's ordinances, so the water stage contingency plan, that is a city ordinance, a rule of the city. And so when you violate those, we can penalize people monetarily for violating the city's laws.
I have one question in the chat from someone that hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet. So I want to get to that, and we should have 1 more minute for Bridgette's question. But the question comes from Gail Jonas. Is the State Water Resources Control Board likely to issue a notice of curtailment notifying Healdsburg that it'll be prohibited from withdrawing 70% of its water? Patrick mentioned a 70% reduction. I wonder if it's in conjunction to a notice of curtailment.
So to answer that question, short, yes, it's in the realm of possibilities. The water supply situation this summer is different than most people or anybody's seen. Lake Mendocino is very, very low in water supply. Lake Sonoma is very, very low in water supply. And so we expect to get some notice from the state this week indicating what level of our water rights might be curtailed. And that starts the conversation about what water supply would be allocated to the city. Obviously, a city has a public health and a public safety need, right? We need water to bathe, to clean, to cook, to flush toilets. And so there's a public health need that's a minimum requirement. And then we'll start talking to the state about that. There's other concerns about, what happens to vegetation in wildfire areas, what happens to long-term vegetation, like such as trees and shrubs. Lawns are going to go brown this summer. That's just what's going to happen. But there's a concern about what happens to our trees long-term, what happens to our shrubs. And so we'll have more information at the end of this week and probably more information about how that progresses this summer later into June. But this summer is different. It's a very concerning situation. And we really, really need people to start finding ways to conserve. And again, you may have seen this at the council meeting last night, but the first 2 weeks of May, water usage for Healdsburg increased by 2%. And there were some earlier numbers, I think Don McInhill shared that, Healdsburg has the highest gallons per capita per day usage in Sonoma County. So Healdsburg needs to pull together and really start thinking about ways that they can conserve water. And then longer term, we need to really start thinking about how do we do that so that these measures don't seem so draconian. And that is the word that's being shared this summer is there's going to be some pretty significant or draconian type of mandates and as far as water conservation.
We are at 7:28. If everyone is okay with hanging out for maybe an additional 3 or 4 minutes, maybe Bridget and Tim can each take about 30 seconds to ask their questions. And then we'll do a
I
very
don't think I can do it in 30 seconds, but but Dave Jones has been trying to get in this meeting and I keep getting a text that he keeps getting put in the waiting room. Sorry to bother you, but I want to be inclusive. There's so much more that needs to be talked about. I'm sorry, we're going to only go to 7:30, but that's what we're doing. So hopefully you'll still take my emails. Thank you.
Absolutely. Tim?
Hey,
Yeah,
Felicia, sorry, go ahead.
I was heartened at the council meeting when Ozzy spoke to, and frankly, it resonated with me when he spoke to that he represents the greater good of the community. And I can't think of anything that serves the community and its greater good more than water. And figuring out a way to come up with the $10 million to get this project handled strikes me like priority one. And I can make a suggestion about the city's budget that there's some earmarked money to the tune of $2 to $2.5 million for a pump track, which would serve a very small collective of people when in comparison to serving every single person in the community if this $10 million project were brought to fruition. So if the pump track were tabled or foregone completely, you could fund 25% of this project.
I think Mark Thamig was trying to jump in. If you want to take a minute to share.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. So we're working on this actively behind the scenes. Our team is responsible for both the parks, and we actually manage the school district facilities as well, the maintenance of those and the irrigation systems, working closely with the golf course. I'm going to share 2 components of an email that I put together to the city manager this week that outlines the complexity of this issue. That the real fact is we shouldn't have grass here at all. We shouldn't. And so we have created this problem, and it's going to be very, very complicated to solve it. So I'm going to share some policy considerations in the chat for you to just review, and then I'll share some fiscal implications in the chat in terms of what we're looking at for bringing in recycled water. So we're really actively working on this because we know this is going to come quick. The city always seems to be behind the 8 ball and reactive, and thanks to Terry and Felicia, we're trying to bring this forward so we can be prepared when that time comes. But you'll see it's complicated. So
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for your input, and we'll look for that in the chat. While that's happening, Griselda, if you want to go to the next slide, and we'll just do a 2-minute debrief and recap about where we're headed. Okay, so we will be bringing this to City Council on June 21st, which means by June 7th, a draft copy of the Urban Water Management Plan that also includes the water shortage contingency plan will be on the website by June 7th, and we will be sharing that out through social media and city channels to make sure people are aware that you have a chance to review it in advance. It will go to council on the 21st for review and potential approval. And then from there, will be submitted to the Department of Water Resources by July 1. I included Patrick Foos's contact information. If you have specific questions about supply or demand, any other questions, you're welcome to direct to me, which is fsmith at the city domain and email address. And just want to share that I definitely heard all of you on potential concerns with hotels. So we will try and get some more specific data around that. And I think that there is a way to work in the looming issue of lawns and pools, particularly in that water shortage contingency plan. So I greatly appreciate everyone being conscientious about that and trying to encourage us to do better.
When you do send your comments or questions to me by email, if you would not mind, put in the subject line, UWMP comment or question, whichever it may be, so that I'll know to focus on that and move it up towards the top of my pile.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. Certainly not the last of these discussions. I will put a plug in. We are going to be hosting a similar drought response specific community meeting on June 3rd to talk, urban water management plan is what's happening in the next 20 years with water supply and demand, but we need to have a more in-depth conversation about what's happening today and right now. Mark your calendars, June 3rd, 6 p.m., but it will be on Facebook Nextdoor city website, and we will do our best to promote that to make sure that everyone is included to talk about drought response. Sound like a plan? Perfect. Okay, with that, I hope everyone has a really nice evening. Take care.